If you think humanity has no strategy, then every move you make from this moment on already belongs to us. The words landed in the silent chamber before anyone realized the human ambassador had even spoken. For one long second, nobody breathed. Then laughter rolled across the Galactic Council like a rising tide. Delegates from dozens of worlds exchanged amused glances while cameras hovered above the polished obsidian floor, broadcasting every reaction to billions of viewers across known space. High strategist Karen slowly rose from his elevated platform, folding his four hands behind his back with the confidence of someone who had never lost a campaign in nearly 2 centuries. His silver ceremonial armor reflected the chamber lights, as if the room itself existed to celebrate his victories. Humanity, he said, his deep voice echoing through the translation network, has courage. We have never questioned that. You charge into impossible situations. You improvise. You survive. But strategy? He smiled without warmth. Strategy requires patience, discipline, and the ability to see 10 moves ahead. Those are qualities your species has never demonstrated. A ripple of agreement spread through the delegates. Several nodded politely. Others openly smirked. They had studied humanity for decades. They admired human engineers, respected human medics, even feared human soldiers on difficult battlefields. But when conversations turned to grand strategy, every military academy in the galaxy reached the same conclusion. Humans reacted well. They did not plan well. Ambassador Daniel Brooks remained seated. His charcoal suit looked painfully ordinary beside the glowing uniforms surrounding him. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket, glanced at the antique wristwatch his grandfather had left him, and quietly closed the leather notebook resting on the desk. His chief of staff, Olivia Harper, leaned closer without taking her eyes off the council floor. "They are trying to provoke you," she whispered. Daniel gave the smallest smile. "No," he answered. "They are grading an exam they have already failed." Olivia looked at him for a moment before leaning back into her chair. She had worked beside Daniel for 11 years. She had learned long ago that when his voice became softer, something much larger was already in motion. Karen stepped forward again, enjoying the attention of the chamber. "Tell us, Ambassador Brooks, if humanity possesses this legendary strategic brilliance you continue to hint at, where is the evidence?" Daniel slowly stood. Every camera pivoted toward him. Instead of answering immediately, he reached into his briefcase and removed a small wooden box no larger than a lunch container. The delegates exchanged confused looks as he carefully opened it and placed 32 carved pieces onto a square wooden board. Black and white. Nothing glowed. Nothing floated. No advanced technology. Just polished wood worn smooth with age. "This," Daniel said calmly, "is called chess." Karen frowned. "A children's game?" "No," Daniel replied. "A mirror." More laughter erupted throughout the chamber. One delegate actually applauded sarcastically, while another shook his head in disbelief. Daniel ignored them all. He gently placed a white king onto its square before looking directly at Karen. "Would you like white?" he asked, "or black?" The room fell strangely quiet. Not because anyone understood the question, but because Daniel Brooks asked it without the slightest trace of humor. There was no anger in his face. No pride. No desperation. Just absolute certainty. High strategist Karen finally smiled again. "You truly believe a board game belongs in a discussion of galactic warfare?" Daniel met his eyes. "No," he answered. "I believe this conversation belongs inside the game. Somewhere beyond the chamber walls, unnoticed by every delegate in attendance, a clock quietly reached the top of the hour. Across hundreds of star systems, thousands of tiny decisions that had seemed unrelated for months continued unfolding exactly as planned. The galaxy believed today's meeting would prove humanity had never understood strategy. Daniel Brooks already knew it would become the first lesson they would never forget. 6 months earlier, long before anyone laughed at a wooden chessboard inside the Galactic Council, humanity began making decisions that confused both its allies and its rivals. One by one, Terran trade convoys quietly withdrew from profitable shipping lanes that they had spent decades building. Frontier listening stations were decommissioned without explanation. Several mining claims near valuable asteroid belts were surrendered after only brief negotiations. Across the galaxy, analysts reached the same conclusion. Earth had become cautious. Some called it weakness. Others called it exhaustion. Daniel Brooks heard every criticism. News commentators questioned his leadership every night. Political opponents demanded his resignation. Even respected military experts wondered aloud whether humanity had finally accepted its place among the older civilizations. During one particularly tense hearing back on Earth, a senator leaned across the table and looked directly at Daniel. "Tell me honestly, are we retreating because we are afraid?" Daniel folded his hands and answered in the same calm voice he used everywhere. "No, Senator." "Then why do we keep giving ground?" The room waited for an explanation. Daniel simply replied, "Because not every step backward is a retreat." The answer satisfied almost no one. After the hearing, Olivia Harper caught up with him outside the Capitol as rain soaked the marble steps. "You could have explained more," she said while opening an umbrella. Daniel smiled faintly as they walked toward the waiting government sedan. The fewer people who understand the plan, the harder it becomes to accidentally destroy it. Olivia sighed. "You know they think you have lost your nerve. That is acceptable. Even your approval rating dropped another 8 points this week." Daniel looked out the window as the city lights blurred behind streaks of rain. History has never rewarded people for looking confident halfway through a chess match. At the same time, inside the Imperial Strategic Command, High Strategist Karen studied fresh intelligence reports with growing satisfaction. Human supply routes had shortened. Patrols had decreased. Diplomatic requests from Earth became noticeably more accommodating. One of his younger officers placed another report on the table. Terran forces abandoned the Vega Transit Relay this morning. Karen barely looked up. "Did they resist?" "No, sir." "Interesting." Another officer smiled. "Perhaps humans have finally accepted reality." Karen slowly nodded. "Not reality. Inevitability." Every report seemed to confirm his belief. Humanity fought hard when cornered, but they lacked the patience required to shape events years in advance. They reacted. Empires planned. That difference, he often reminded his students, separated survivors from rulers. Meanwhile, life on Earth continued as though nothing extraordinary was happening. Families went to work. Children filled neighborhood parks. Coffee shops opened before sunrise. Baseball games still packed stadiums on warm Friday nights. Daniel often walked through those ordinary streets without security whenever his schedule allowed. He liked hearing conversations that had nothing to do with politics or war. One Saturday morning, an elderly man recognized him outside a small diner in Virginia. "Ambassador," the man called out, "I hope you know what you are doing." Daniel smiled and shook the man's hand. "So do I." The old man laughed. "That is not exactly comforting." Daniel glanced toward a father teaching his daughter how to move wooden chess pieces on a picnic table across the street. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the safest move is the one that looks like a mistake until the whole board comes into view." The first person to notice the pattern was not an admiral, a politician, or a famous strategist. It was a quiet data analyst named Rebecca Collins working the overnight shift at Terran Strategic Logistics in Colorado Springs. Her job was simple: compare shipping records, fuel consumption, customs reports, and commercial insurance claims across hundreds of systems. Most nights, she spent 12 hours staring at numbers that nobody else wanted to read. Around 2:15 in the morning, she frowned at her screen and called her supervisor. "Mark, can you come look at this?" Mark Henderson walked over with a cup of stale coffee. "Please tell me the computer is wrong." Rebecca rotated the display toward him. "I wish it was." Colored lines stretched across a star map, showing commercial routes, military patrols, and imperial expansion over the previous 6 months. Individually, nothing seemed unusual. Together, the picture felt strangely organized. Mark studied the map for nearly a minute before speaking. "That cannot be accidental." Rebecca nodded. "Every time we surrendered a trade lane, the Empire shifted a fleet." She highlighted another layer. "Every time we closed a listening station, they reassigned surveillance ships somewhere else." Mark leaned closer. "And every relocation opened another corridor." Rebecca smiled for the first time that night. "Exactly. They think they are choosing these positions." She paused before quietly adding, "But every choice keeps reducing their options." The report reached Daniel Brooks before sunrise. He read every page without changing expression. Olivia Harper watched him from across the conference table. "Rebecca wants to know if her conclusions are correct." Daniel closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "Tell her she just became one of 7 people who now understand part of the board." Olivia raised an eyebrow. Only part. Nobody gets the entire picture. Not even Admiral Grace Walker? Daniel shook his head. Grace knows the military moves. Rebecca understands logistics. You understand diplomacy. I understand timing. If any one of us disappears tomorrow, the plan still survives. Thousands of light years away, Karen held his own strategic briefing inside the Imperial Command Hall. Massive holographic maps floated above a circular table while senior officers proudly presented their latest territorial gains. Terran commercial influence has declined another 11%, one officer reported. Excellent, Karen replied. Continue increasing pressure along the outer corridors. Another commander pointed towards several newly occupied systems. Human merchant traffic has almost vanished from these sectors. Karen smiled with quiet satisfaction. They are making our work remarkably easy. Nobody in the room questioned why every human withdrawal seemed almost too orderly. Success has a dangerous habit of silencing curiosity. Back on Earth, Daniel visited Admiral Grace Walker inside Fleet Command. She stood beside a floor-to-ceiling tactical display, studying dozens of blinking markers. They accepted every invitation, Grace said. Daniel looked at the screen without speaking. Every single one, she continued. Exactly where you predicted. Daniel finally allowed himself the smallest smile. Good. Grace folded her arms. Do you ever worry that one unexpected decision could ruin everything? Daniel walked closer to the display until the reflected stars covered his face. Every morning. Then why do you look so calm? He answered without taking his eyes off the map. Because they still believe this is their game. Outside Fleet Command, the afternoon sun reflected off the windows of nearby office buildings while employees headed home for the weekend. Families filled restaurants. Teenagers laughed outside movie theaters. Somewhere, another father unfolded a wooden chessboard and showed his son that sometimes the strongest piece on the board never needed to move first. At that same moment, across dozens of distant star systems, Imperial commanders confidently issued new orders, never realizing that every command they gave carried them exactly one move closer to the position Daniel Brooks had been patiently building from the very beginning. Project Endgame officially did not exist. There was no budget line, no public record, and no office with its name on the door. If someone searched every government archive on Earth, they would find nothing except ordinary departments handling transportation, trade, and diplomatic affairs. That was exactly how Daniel Brooks wanted it. Late one evening, long after most lights inside the Pentagon Annex had gone dark, Daniel stepped into a secure conference room where Admiral Grace Walker was already waiting beside a digital map that remained completely blank until the heavy door locked behind him. Olivia Harper entered next, carrying a plain folder instead of a tablet. Daniel smiled when he noticed it. Paper again? Olivia nodded. Nothing to hack. Grace folded her arms. We have 6 people in this room. Daniel quietly corrected her. 6 people who each know a different story. Grace looked puzzled. Daniel walked to the center of the room and placed a wooden knight from his chess set on the otherwise empty table. Nobody outside this room can ever understand the entire plan. Nobody inside this room can either. Olivia looked at him. You still think compartmentalization is necessary? Daniel answered without hesitation. It is the only reason the plan survives if one of us makes a mistake. Grace pointed toward the blank display. Fleet Command keeps asking why they only receive partial deployment orders. Because partial orders cannot reveal complete intentions, Daniel replied. He pressed a small control on the table. The blank display suddenly filled with stars, shipping lanes, diplomatic routes, commercial insurance networks, and civilian traffic patterns. It looked less like a military operation and more like the daily heartbeat of civilization itself. Grace studied the image carefully. This is not a battlefield. Daniel shook his head. No, this is what creates battlefields. He highlighted freight schedules moving through dozens of systems. Every army depends on food. Another layer appeared. Every fleet depends on maintenance. Another. Every alliance depends on trust. Finally, another network spread across the map. And every empire depends on believing tomorrow will look exactly like today. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Olivia finally broke the silence. If they notice even one connection, they will not, Daniel said. Because they are looking for weapons. Grace slowly smiled. While we are rearranging habits. Daniel nodded once. People think strategy begins when fleets move. Real strategy begins long before anyone realizes they are making choices. The meeting lasted almost 4 hours. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody celebrated. Every decision felt painfully ordinary. One shipment delayed by 2 days. One diplomatic visit quietly canceled. One research station relocated by 70 miles. One commercial contract allowed to expire without renewal. Taken separately, each action looked forgettable. Together, they slowly reshaped the behavior of an entire galaxy. As the meeting ended, Grace remained behind while Daniel gathered his papers. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. How many nights have you actually slept this month?" Daniel laughed softly. "More than you think." Grace looked unconvinced. "You always seem calm." Daniel placed the wooden knight back into its box before closing the lid. "Calm is not the same as comfortable." He paused for a moment. "Every morning I wake up wondering if today is the day someone sees the board." Grace watched him leave without another word. Outside, the first light of dawn stretched across Washington as commuters filled highways. Coffee shops unlocked their doors, and school buses began their routes. Life looked perfectly ordinary. Across the stars, Imperial commanders confidently continued making independent decisions, never realizing those choices were slowly connecting into a picture that only one quiet man on Earth had been patient enough to imagine from the very beginning. The celebration began before the reports were even verified. Across the Imperial capital, banners filled the skyline as commentators declared the latest campaign the decisive turning point in humanity's decline. The Vega Transit Relay, once described as the gateway connecting dozens of prosperous systems, now flew Imperial colors. Every major network replayed the same headline. Humanity had surrendered another strategic position without a fight. Inside the Galactic Council, delegates congratulated High Strategist Karen for what they believed was the final proof that patience always defeated improvisation. Karen accepted every compliment with practiced humility, but there was no hiding the satisfaction in his eyes. One council member raised a glass to another victory earned through superior planning. The chamber echoed with polite applause. Karen simply smiled. The outcome was inevitable. Humanity mistakes determination for strategy. Eventually, determination always runs out. Nearly every species agreed. The captured relay connected trade routes, fuel depots, communications traffic, and commercial inspections. Military analysts predicted Earth would spend decades recovering from the economic damage alone. Back on Earth, the evening news painted a much darker picture. Financial markets reacted immediately. Business leaders questioned the government's decisions. Families watched interviews with frustrated veterans who struggled to understand why another position had been abandoned. At a small house outside Columbus, Ohio, Daniel Brooks sat at his sister's dinner table while his teenage nephew stared at the television. "Uncle Daniel," the boy finally asked, "did we really lose?" The room became quiet. Daniel looked around the table before answering. "What do you think losing looks like?" His nephew shrugged. "Giving away something important." Daniel smiled gently. "Sometimes you give away something because holding it costs more than letting someone else carry it." The teenager frowned. "That sounds backwards. Most good strategy does it first." Later that night, Daniel returned to his office where Olivia Harper was already waiting with a stack of fresh intelligence reports. She closed the door behind him. The Empire officially moved their fourth fleet into Vega. Daniel placed his coat over a chair. "Earlier than expected?" Olivia nodded. "By almost 3 days." "Interesting." She studied his face. "You are not surprised?" "No, relieved." Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "Closer." Olivia opened another report. "Our allies are nervous. 3 governments have requested emergency consultations." Daniel looked out the window toward the city lights. "Schedule them." "What should I tell them?" He turned back with the same calm expression she had seen through every crisis. "Tell them events are proceeding normally." Olivia laughed despite herself. "Nobody is going to believe that." Daniel picked up the old leather notebook that rarely left his desk. He slowly opened it, revealing page after page filled with handwritten dates, system names, shipping routes, and short observations that meant almost nothing to anyone else. Without hesitation, he wrote a single new entry near the bottom of the page. "Move 27. Olivia noticed the words but asked no questions. She had learned that every note in that notebook represented months of preparation. Daniel quietly closed the cover and rested his hand on it for a second. Somewhere beyond Earth's skies, the Empire believed it had just captured the most valuable square on the board. Somewhere beyond their celebrations, fleets adjusted schedules, merchants rerouted cargo, insurance contracts quietly activated, and alliances responded exactly as years of predictable behavior suggested they would. Karen believed he had just taken the queen. Daniel Brooks knew the move had never been about the peace. It had always been about the position left behind after the applause ended. 3 weeks after the celebration at Vega, tiny irregularities began appearing across the Imperial network. None of them seemed important on their own. A refinery reported a routine fuel delay because too many commercial freighters had arrived at once. A supply convoy requested a new departure window after civilian traffic unexpectedly filled a major jump corridor. An agricultural shipment from a neutral world arrived 4 days late because insurance inspectors insisted on new verification procedures. Every report was filed, approved, and forgotten. Inside Imperial Logistics Command, junior officers spent long hours solving what looked like ordinary scheduling problems. Move the convoy to Thursday, one supervisor said without looking up from his terminal. If Thursday is full, his assistant asked. Then Friday. The decisions were simple, practical, completely reasonable. Every adjustment solved today's problem while quietly creating tomorrow's. On Earth, Rebecca Collins watched the updates arrive one after another across her monitoring screen. Colored lines slowly shifted across the digital map exactly as they had in Daniel Brooks's handwritten projections months earlier. She called Mark Henderson again, almost afraid to believe what she was seeing. "Tell me I missed something," she said. Mark compared the newest reports against Daniel's forecast. After several silent minutes, he slowly leaned back in his chair. "No," he whispered. "They are doing it again." Rebecca pointed toward a growing cluster of systems. Every reroute forces another reroute, and every correction makes the next correction even more predictable. Mark looked toward the secure communication terminal. "We should inform Ambassador Brooks." Daniel received the update during a meeting with Admiral Grace Walker. Rebecca's analysis appeared on the wall between them, showing dozens of tiny movements spreading across Imperial territory like ripples across a quiet lake. Grace studied the display carefully. "No battles." "None," Daniel answered. "No sabotage." "None." "No secret weapon." Daniel smiled. "Just people solving the problems directly in front of them." Grace folded her arms. "They are building their own cage." Daniel nodded once. One perfectly reasonable decision at a time. Grace remained silent before asking the question that had been bothering her for weeks. "What if Karen notices now?" Daniel walked to the display and enlarged one section of the map. Thousands of commercial routes filled the screen. He cannot personally approve millions of daily decisions. He highlighted another layer. Neither can his admirals. Another layer appeared. Or his governors. Finally, he looked back at Grace. Empires become predictable because success teaches everyone to think the same way. Meanwhile, inside Imperial Strategic Command, Karen received another logistics summary. He barely glanced at it before signing the authorization. "Anything important?" he asked. His operations director shook his head. "Minor transportation bottlenecks. Civilian freight congestion. Fuel scheduling. Nothing affecting readiness." Karen handed the report back. "Then do not waste my afternoon." As the meeting ended, one young analyst hesitated. "Sir, there is one unusual pattern." Every conversation stopped. "Speak." The delays appear unrelated, but they keep reinforcing one another across multiple sectors. Karen looked at the chart for less than 5 seconds before returning it. "That is what happens when an empire grows. Complexity is the price of success." The analyst nodded, although something still felt wrong. Thousands of light years away, Daniel Brooks quietly closed another page in his leather notebook. Olivia Harper noticed there was no celebration in his face. "You expected this," she said. Daniel looked out toward the evening sky beyond his office window. "I hoped for it." "There is a difference?" Olivia asked. Daniel answered softly. "Hope is what you feel before the board begins to move by itself." The first Imperial fleet stopped without a single warning shot. It simply reached the edge of the Helios corridor and waited. Navigation computers insisted the approved fuel convoy had not arrived. The convoy commander insisted he had never received departure clearance. The station supervisor produced signed authorization showing the schedule had been changed 2 weeks earlier. Every document was authentic. Every signature was legitimate. Every person involved had followed procedure exactly. Similar reports began arriving from neighboring sectors within hours. Cargo inspectors requested additional verification because warehouses had reached maximum capacity. Maintenance crews delayed departures after discovering replacement parts were sitting on another station waiting for transport that had already been reassigned somewhere else. None of the delays sounded dramatic. They sounded ordinary. That was what made them dangerous. Inside Fleet Command on Earth, Admiral Grace Walker watched dozens of blue markers appear one after another across the strategic display. There, she whispered, pointing toward 3 Imperial formations. They cannot support each other anymore. Daniel Brooks stood beside her with both hands resting behind his back. He said nothing. Another notification appeared. Then another. Rebecca Collins' predictive model quietly highlighted every location that would experience the same problem over the next 72 hours. Grace looked at Daniel. This is happening faster than I expected. Daniel finally spoke. Not faster. He gently tapped the display. Only more visibly. Olivia Harper entered carrying fresh diplomatic traffic. Neutral systems are asking questions. Grace looked up. About what? Olivia smiled. They cannot understand why the Empire suddenly keeps postponing trade deliveries. Daniel accepted the reports without opening them. Good. Grace laughed softly. You planned an operation that looks like paperwork. Daniel answered with the same calm voice he had used from the beginning. Empires prepare for attacks. Very few prepare for inconvenience. Across the galaxy, High Strategist Karen convened an emergency logistics review. Senior officers filled the chamber while holographic charts rotated above the central table. Explain this, Karen demanded. An operations director cleared his throat. Our fleets remain fully operational, but synchronized movement has become increasingly difficult. Why? Civilian transport congestion. Another officer quickly added, temporary maintenance scheduling. A third pointed toward another report. Commercial fuel allocation. Karen frowned. None of the explanations sounded serious. Yet together they produced the same result. Fleets that normally moved with perfect coordination were now arriving hours apart, sometimes days apart, forcing commanders to constantly revise their own plans. One younger strategist hesitated before speaking. Sir, every adjustment seems reasonable. Karen looked directly at him. Then what concerns you? The officer swallowed. Someone may have predicted how we would solve each problem. The room became completely silent. Karen slowly stood. You are suggesting our decisions are being controlled? No, sir. The officer chose his next words carefully. Only anticipated. Karen dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand. Impossible. Nobody can predict millions of independent choices. Thousands of light years away, Daniel Brooks quietly watched the sunrise from the balcony outside Fleet Command. Grace joined him carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him. Did you hear what the analyst said? Daniel nodded. He was the first. Grace smiled. The first to understand. Daniel looked toward the bright horizon before answering. The first to ask the correct question. He took a slow sip of coffee. Once someone asks the correct question, the game changes. Grace looked back through the window at the map filled with blinking Imperial formations. Then are we finally ready? Daniel's expression remained steady. No, he watched another blue marker quietly lock into place. We are simply waiting for our opponent to realize the board has been shrinking around them this entire time. The council chamber had never been this quiet. The laughter that had filled the room earlier had disappeared, replaced by dozens of uneasy conversations spoken just softly enough that nobody wanted to admit they were worried. High Strategist Karen stood before the central tactical display while new reports continued arriving faster than his staff could organize them. Trade schedules were slipping across multiple sectors. Commercial insurers had temporarily suspended coverage on several major corridors because delivery times had become impossible to predict. Neutral worlds were quietly redirecting contracts toward smaller regional partners simply because Imperial shipping had become unreliable. None of it looked like a military defeat. It looked far worse. It looked like confidence quietly evaporating. Karen turned toward his advisors. Someone explain why every projection continues to diverge from reality. An economist stepped forward first. Our production remains stable. Another official added, fleet readiness remains above 96%. A logistics director spoke next. Individual systems are functioning normally. Karen stared at the display. Then why does nothing work together anymore? Nobody answered. Back on Earth, Daniel Brooks received an invitation to address the Galactic Council. Olivia Harper read the message twice before looking up. They want an explanation. Daniel buttoned his jacket. No, Olivia frowned. No, they want reassurance. Admiral Grace Walker looked up from her console. Will you give it to them? Daniel smiled faintly. Not today. Hours later, Daniel walked back into the same chamber where Karen had mocked humanity months earlier. The wooden chessboard rested inside the same plain box under his arm. Delegates watched him with curiosity instead of amusement this time. Nobody laughed when he placed the board on the table. Nobody made sarcastic comments about an ancient human game. Karen finally broke the silence. You knew this would happen. Daniel looked at him calmly. Yes. How? Daniel opened the wooden box and carefully arranged the pieces exactly as he had during their first meeting. White on one side, black on the other. He gently touched one pawn without moving it. You believe strategy is the art of controlling your own moves. Karen remained silent. Daniel continued. Humanity learned something different a very long time ago. He looked around the chamber. Real strategy is understanding which move your opponent believes they are choosing freely. Several delegates exchanged uncertain glances. Daniel picked up a knight and placed it on the center of the board. Most people think chess is about attacking the king. He slowly shook his head. It is not. He pointed toward the remaining pieces. It is about shaping the board until every reasonable choice leads to the same destination. A science delegate quietly leaned forward. You are saying the empire trapped itself. Daniel met the delegate's eyes. I am saying nobody forced them to make a single decision. The chamber felt completely silent. Karen looked toward the tactical display showing hundreds of disconnected delays spreading across Imperial territory. For the first time in his career, he stopped searching for hidden weapons, secret fleets, or invisible technology. Instead, he began replaying months of perfectly logical decisions inside his own mind. One trade agreement, one fuel reassignment, one fleet relocation, one administrative approval after another. Each had seemed harmless. Each had been his own choice. Daniel quietly closed the wooden box. Chess was never designed to teach people how to win, he said. It was designed to teach them how easily confidence becomes predictable. Nobody spoke after that. Across the chamber, the same delegates who had once dismissed humanity as impulsive now stared at a simple wooden board as though it had become the most intimidating object they had ever seen. No fleet fired the final shot because there was no final battle to fight. Over the following weeks, the Empire slowly withdrew from positions it had celebrated only months earlier. Supply lines were shortened. Patrol schedules were rewritten. Trade agreements were quietly renegotiated. Every decision sounded practical. Every announcement was presented as routine. Yet everyone watching understood the truth. The Empire was not retreating from an enemy. It was retreating from the consequences of its own decisions. Inside the Galactic Council, delegates no longer argued about whether humanity possessed strategic vision. The debate had become something entirely different. They wanted to understand how an entire civilization had been guided toward a destination without ever realizing it was following a path someone else had already mapped. High strategist Karen requested one final private meeting before returning home. Daniel Brooks accepted without hesitation. The chamber they met in overlooked a field of stars stretching farther than either of them could see. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Karen finally broke the silence. I spent my entire career believing strategy meant controlling people. Daniel rested both hands on the wooden chessboard lying between them. Many people do. Karen looked at the worn pieces with genuine curiosity. When did you know you had won? Daniel smiled softly. The day you stopped asking what humanity was planning and started asking why humanity kept making mistakes. Karen lowered his eyes. Because I assumed confident people do not make mistakes. Daniel gently picked up the old white king before placing it back on its square. Confident people make mistakes every day. Wise people simply leave room to recover from them. Karen slowly nodded, absorbing the words more carefully than any military briefing he had ever attended. Then this was never really about chess. No, Daniel answered. Chess was only a language. The lesson existed long before the game. Months later, military academies across the galaxy quietly revised their curriculum. Courses that once focused only on fleet strength and advanced technology now devoted entire semesters to human decision-making, logistics, psychology, economics, patience, and the strange habit humans had of sacrificing something valuable today to protect something even more valuable tomorrow. Students often ask the same question. Why did humanity choose an ancient board game to explain modern strategy? Their instructors usually smiled before answering. Because the pieces are never the point. Back on Earth, life continued exactly as Daniel had always hoped it would. Children hurried into school carrying oversized backpacks. Morning commuters waited in line for coffee before work. Parks filled with families on warm weekends. One quiet Saturday afternoon, Daniel sat beneath a large oak tree in a neighborhood park while his young niece carefully studied a wooden chessboard resting between them. She stared at the pieces for nearly a full minute before looking up. "Uncle Daniel," she asked, "how do you know which move is the best one?" Daniel looked around the park before answering. Parents laughed with their children. Friends shared stories on nearby benches. A golden retriever chased a bright red ball across the grass. Nobody recognized the man sitting at the picnic table. Nobody knew he had helped reshape the future of the galaxy. Daniel smiled and gently moved a single pawn forward one square. "You usually do not," he said. "You simply make the move that gives tomorrow more possibilities than today." His niece nodded as though the answer made perfect sense. She reached across the board and made her own move. Daniel smiled again, not because she had chosen the strongest move, but because she had chosen it with patience instead of fear. Years later, historians would write about fleets, treaties, and political victories. Those things mattered, but they were never the real story. The real story was much quieter. It was about a civilization that refused to confuse loudness with strength, speed with wisdom, or victory with understanding. And perhaps the greatest lesson humanity ever offered the galaxy was not how to win a game, but how to live a life where every thoughtful choice today becomes hope for someone else's tomorrow.